sure you don't be hurt now. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm originally from Southern California. I was born actually in East Los Angeles, and we moved to a city called South Pasadena when I was about 8 years old, right after third grade. And for those of you not familiar, it was like moving from a heavily Hispanic, low-income area to more of a white middle-class area. You know, my parents actually, my dad actually came into a little bit of money from like a long-lost relative who died. And with that, and with working overtime for like 6 months, we're able to afford to move out of the neighborhood. And that kind of provided more opportunities than we would have had, you know, in regards to being in a better school system. But it also caused a lot of stress, you know, because I'm third generation Mexican American, my name doesn't reflect it. Hovey actually is a Scandinavian name, and most Hoveys in the world are tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, and that's not me. But what happened is my grandfather was adopted into a Hovey family and took on the name. But our roots are, you know, mostly Mexican, with a little bit of Native American thrown in there. And so I experienced a fair amount of discrimination for the first time, you know, because of the way I looked, the way I spoke, so on and so forth. And so later on, once I became a psychologist, I realized that had an influence on me, because a lot of what I've studied is a culture of distress and discrimination, things like that. But what happened is I ended up going to college. I ended up at UCLA, and I majored in anthropology. And the reason is I was really interested in culture. And at the time, I was interested in becoming maybe a school teacher. And I wanted like a broad liberal arts type of education, which I received. But at UCLA, being in a social science meant you had to take a lot of other courses in other social sciences like sociology and psychology. And I kind of fell in love with psychology partway through being my undergrad experience. And it was too late in a way to change my major, but I realized I had a pretty good solid psychology background. But in order to be competitive for a clinical psychology PhD program, I did need to take some time off and do the sorts of things that maybe some of you are doing now. I got some research experience. I took maybe about 4 psychology courses that I didn't take as an undergrad. And I also worked as a counselor, both in a group home setting, but also I worked at a place called the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center. And there's actually quite a long history to this place. It was like the very first hotline in the country. It was started by someone named Ed Schneidman, who's like the father of suicidology. You know, if you look him up, he's really the very first person, him and Norman Farborough, to study suicide scientifically. And he actually was one of the professors I took a course under at UCLA. So it kind of felt like I was working in a center that he developed, but also I took a course on death and dying with him. But my experience at the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center to this day has influenced the sort of work I do. And I think that's a good place to start on my PowerPoints, because what I want to show, let me just share my screen in a bit once I get to the proper slide. And Stephanie, if you don't mind, I think after this, I want to email you my slides. I'm not going to be able to go over all of them, but there's a lot of information that I think the students would find helpful.
Okay, yeah, perfect. We actually do have a mailing list, so
Okay.
I'll go ahead and send it out.
Okay, so let me see if I can get this going here. Do you see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, it's like a title. Okay, so what I want to do is explain, and this is a good example of how clinical work can influence research and vice versa. So before I was able to work as a suicide prevention counselor, I underwent a couple months worth of training. So I basically went to the center about 3 nights a week for 2 months on end. Had all sorts of training, not just learning about suicide risk and learning how to work as a counselor, but a lot of role playing. And back then we didn't have like internet and so forth. We did everything over the phone. And so part of our training would involve, for example, being in a dark room, one of us role playing the caller, the other person, the counselor, having supervisors in the room to tell you what you're doing wrong, what you're doing right, and so forth. And so I thought it was really, really comprehensive in regards to what we were trained to do. However, once I started working the phone lines, most of my difficult calls, or a lot of my most difficult calls, I felt totally unprepared for. So I want to kind of show you, and this is like a really, really old overhead, but this was like in our training handbook, this was one of the main pages that covered what the training covered. Crisis call models, so in other words, a little bit of theory, lethality assessment, in other words, how to determine how at risk a given caller was at a given time. Excuse me. Counseling techniques, so the sort of techniques we would use, types of callers. So we'd have people, for example, who would call one time only, and once you got them through the crisis, they seemed to be okay. But we also had callers who were more chronic, where they would call 2 or 3 times a week on end and almost would use us as like a therapy session, right? So we had to learn how to deal with both types of callers. And then we had special at-risk populations amongst the youth, amongst the elderly, and so forth. Is there anything here that you think is missing? What do you think, everyone? What is not covered? And this was in the early 90s, early to mid 90s. Is there anything that's
different cultures?
Yeah, different cultures is not there at all. I mean, very good answer. And probably knowing what I study, it was a dead giveaway. Nothing at all about ethnicity or culture or immigration, acculturation, and so forth. And what I find amazing is this was like in the 1990s, where California was undergoing a lot of anti-immigration stuff at the time. Kind of like we are nationwide now, but it was a really big thing in California. And so lots of my difficult callers were people who had called up. And the interesting thing is my experience working there overlapped with the first Gulf War. So I remember I had some callers who had immigrated from the Middle East. And I remember one caller in specific who had immigrated maybe 20 years earlier, spoke perfect English, had a little bit of an accent, but not much, but was undergoing the sort of stuff that you might think one undergoes early on in the immigration process. Loneliness, feeling like you didn't belong, feeling disconnected, having no friends, feeling like you don't know the cultural norms, a lot of discrimination and so forth. And so, of course, I thought when I went to grad school, it would be interesting to see what sort of research had been done looking at immigration and suicide. And actually, I was lucky enough to get into my first choice. I wanted to go to University of Michigan. I got accepted after a couple years off from school. So I took 2 years off, got all sorts of experience, and got accepted into Michigan. And so this was like really important in regards to developing my line of research. And when I first got to grad school, what I found in regards to immigration and suicide were studies that would compare immigrants to non-immigrants. So for example, the first study I list here was a study that was typical, which is they collected information from around the world on different kinds of immigrant groups. The main criteria was, did someone move to this country at some point in their lives? And then they compared suicide rates with this group versus the rest of the general population. And what they found is that there was a higher rate amongst immigrants. But what is one of the problems with setting up a study like this? We have just a big lump group of immigrants from all around the world versus people who weren't.
Yeah, many different factors, right? Such as culture, background, those all affect them.
Right, it was kind of a weird group because you had people from Latin America, people from English-speaking countries, and I remember they also had some Canadian immigrants. So we're looking at a study that was done in the US, right? So there's nothing at all about particular ethnicities or particular immigrant groups. There's also studies comparing different ethnic groups. So studies comparing Mexican immigrants, Mexican American immigrants versus people who weren't Mexican American. And so Roberts, for example, did a lot of these studies. And what they found are those individuals who had immigrated here, like Mexican Americans, they were more at risk for suicide or suicide ideation. But what was missing were studies that looked at within group variabilities. So in other words, looking at people who are Mexican American, maybe first generation, so they had migrated here at some point. What were those risk factors within that group that predicted bad mental health versus more adaptive functioning, right? We didn't have any of those studies. Everything were between ethnic group comparisons or immigrants versus non-immigrants. Also, part of what I was grappling with at this time is how to capture the phenomena that I had encountered as a counselor. So like I mentioned, the guy from the Middle East, he was kind of describing something that was a little bit amorphous. I just don't feel connected. I feel a lot of stress. I feel like I don't belong. I don't really feel like I know the cultural norms. The best term that I found in the literature was called acculturative stress, which is basically the sort of stress that one undergoes when one acculturates to a new environment, to a new country, and so forth. The problem is with this line of research is acculturative stress was always the dependent variable. In other words, there's a fair amount of research that looked at what factors predicted acculturative stress. But what I was interested in was for those individuals who were experiencing a lot of acculturative stress, were they more at risk for depression and anxiety and feeling suicidal? Now, of course, you could assume that they were, but assuming it's different from actually showing it research-wise. And so there hadn't been any studies at that point that actually linked acculturative stress with mental health. And so part of what I did, and I don't want to get bogged down in lots of these slides, but I did a handful of studies that looked at different kinds of Latino groups, first generation immigrants in Southern California. And the reason why I collected data there, although I was in Michigan, is that's where all my connections were. So I was able to connect data for adolescents and for adults in Los Angeles. And I found, what I expected, which is acculturative stress was very strongly linked to mental health. I mean, if you're looking at correlations, we're looking at 0.5, 0.6. I mean, a really, really strong connection. But part of what I also wanted to focus on were the sort of factors that were also protective. And so I found that, family, of course, is very important. But as you might also expect, hopefulness for the future. So I wasn't like looking at the Beck hopelessness scale. It was more like I wanted to see what sort of hopefulness factors were particular to these groups. And so part of what I did is I collected open-ended data. So I asked individuals what they thought their life would be like in the future. And then I looked at some of these responses and I coded them. Were they hopeful? Were they not hopeful? And then I was looking at this as a hopefulness factor. And so I think it's kind of neat because not only do I have quantitative data, but I have data that was qualitative. And when I published lots of this, I made sure to include a lot of the qualitative stuff because I think this information is very rich and it kind of shows you who these people were behind the numbers. And so one example, for example, of something that was non-hopeful was a 17-year-old teenager who said, I don't know how my future will be. Rejection from those I love hurts. I feel as if I don't matter. I think my future will worsen each day a bit more. And life for me is not worth anything now, nor will it ever be. Really depressing stuff. But it kind of showed you who these people were. And I did the same sort of study in adults, found the same sort of findings. In addition to family support, I looked outside the family and sure enough found that social support really seemed to alleviate lots of the suffering that we saw in some of these individuals. And I have some more examples of hopefulness. It's difficult to achieve success today, but I feel sure about struggling against the tide. I came to this country to achieve success, which in my country is not possible. But today I'm fortunate to have with my family, sure of myself. And so this is like really hopeful, compared to something like this. And one of the things I found is that people who are hopeless, I mean, their answers are straight and short, straight to the point. I think everything gained is going backwards. I think my future is going to be a disaster. So these are pretty easy to cope. But again, I found that those individuals who were hopeless towards the future were doing much worse in regards to their functioning. I also collected data in Central American refugees, which is kind of unique because if you look at the literature looking at mental health in Central Americans, there's only a handful of studies that are published. And the difference between refugees and immigrants is the push versus pull factors. So for individuals who are pushed out of their country, like lots of what we're seeing on the border now, we have a lot of individuals who are getting into this country who are really fleeing a lot of violence and bad stuff happening in Central America. And so part of what I looked at were PTSD symptoms, which were closely linked to depression and suicide. I collected data from Southern California, but also a pretty big study looking at individuals in Chicago and Cincinnati. I found the same links with the culture of stress and so forth, but also found a lot of PTSD and a lot of people who were either hopeful or hopeless, and we're able to ask them what they felt like at the moment they decided to migrate here. Were you hopeful about your future in this country? And those who were fared much better once they got to this country. Those who kind of like weren't hopeful at the moment of migration were not doing well, even years in advance. And here's an example of a narrative qualitative data. Someone who is 64 years old, she says she feels happy to even be alive. She came from a country in war, survived all the ugliness that went on there. And she was held hostage for 12 days. They killed her husband, but she did get out with her 2 kids. So she was very actually hopeful about being here, despite her traumatic past. So this was from part of the data in California, actually. Okay, so I did a lot of studies. To kind of summarize this first phase of my career, as I mentioned, most studies of a culture of stress looked at a culture of stress as the endpoint, but I actually looked at possible consequences of severe stress. And I found a lot of risk factors that I talked about and protective factors, things that kind of protect people against bad mental health once they migrate. My second set of studies that I'm pretty well known for is I did a lot of work looking at migrant farm workers in the Midwest. And I collected data. I was interested in continuing looking at mental health in immigrants, but most of the immigrants in the Midwest were actually migrant farm workers who were migrating from South Texas. So ironically, here I am, to Ohio and Michigan on a yearly basis. So I collected a lot of data, did the same sort of research looking at a culture of stress. But one thing that I found out after a couple of years is that the culture of stress scale that I had did not fully capture the stressors that farm workers were undergoing. So there was a lot of stress that they were undergoing that wasn't related to being new to the country. It was more related to being a farm worker, migrating back and forth year after year. And so I kind of went back to ground zero. And my research team and I actually spent a couple of summers at farm worker camps, and we did a lot of open-ended interviews to find out about their lives and about what contributed to depression and anxiety and so forth. And so it kind of boiled down to this, all these different stressors that we're able to code from all the qualitative research. Some of the stuff you would expect, like being away from family or friends, hard physical labor, and so forth. But some of the stuff was kind of unique. And I wanted to kind of explain what some of it was. Exploitation, people didn't get paid sometimes, and they were afraid to complain because they wanted the jobs. Something that we termed emotional isolation. So it's not only being away from family and friends, it's like the sensation that you can't really connect with anyone anymore. And so this was actually a really interesting and kind of depressing narrative. It was from a 36-year-old male who says, "It's difficult coming here without my family. I cry because I'm lonely. There's no one to talk to. You can't just walk up to someone and carry on a conversation because it makes me feel like a stray vagrant. I get this hopeless feeling, a helpless feeling. You want to make friends with someone and you can't because everybody knows that you're just temporary and just passing through. So they don't trust you. They don't want to take the responsibility of helping you." So again, we had like a handful of people who talked about how over the course of time, they felt more and more disconnected from people, isolated, even when there were people that they were living with in the camp. They just felt like they couldn't reach out anymore. And this is very closely related to negative mental health. And so part of what we did is we used all the qualitative data, and I came up with a new stress scale called the Migrant Farm Worker Stress Inventory. And so the reason why I did this is I wanted to have a psychological tool that you can give farm workers, and you can kind of figure out whether or not they're high at risk for things like depression and anxiety. And I have a lot of data with this, but I wanted to just show one slide. So migrant farm work stress was measured by the new scale that we came up with. And you can see that people who were suicidal or not were different on all sorts of things. So we have the traditional scales looking at self-esteem, hopelessness, anxiety, depression, and so forth. But we also had this new concept called migrant farm work stress. And you can see those who were suicidal were a lot more stressed than those who weren't. And we also have something called odds ratios. And what that means is that the best way to interpret this is those individuals who had high stress were 1.5 times more likely to be suicidal. Those individuals who are hopeless were more than 2 times as likely to be suicidal, and so forth. One of the things I looked at was marital status. Those individuals who were not married were actually more likely to be suicidal. So I think being married actually provided a level of support. So this slide just kind of captures how I was able to get qualitative data, turn it into a quantitative scale, and able to contribute something above and beyond the traditional psychological scales, looking at hopelessness, anxiety, and self-esteem, and so forth. So when I came to Texas, part of the reason why I took the job was to help develop a PhD program, but also I wanted to continue the sort of research that I had done. And so what I want to do for the next 15 minutes is talk about 2 studies that I haven't published yet, but I think the data are kind of really, really interesting. One thing that I want to talk about is there's a couple decades worth of studies, especially from a data set called the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance. It's high school data, it's national. It's not just on suicide, but if you look at the suicide data, you'll see that for a couple decades now, if you compare different ethnic groups, Hispanic individuals report more suicide behavior, more suicide ideation compared to Anglo groups and compared to African American groups. But if you break it down, it's actually the Latinas, the teenage girls compared to the boys who are driving this behavior. So what you see is higher rates of ideation, suicide attempts, and near lethal suicide attempts. But if you take a step back and look at suicide rates, it's not necessarily translating into completed suicides. So there's something going on about the suicide behavior itself amongst Latina adolescents. And so before I talk about some of the data, I'm wondering if some of you have any ideas why we might see that, why we might see like elevated rates of ideation and suicide attempts amongst Latina adolescents compared to all other groups. What's going on here? Anybody want to share their thoughts?
I think personally, my father is from Mexico. My mother is from here, but she's Mexican American as well. I've seen, my mother's side of the family, they're from here. My father's side is from Mexico, and I have noticed a trend of a lot more pressure is put on adolescent females in Mexican culture, at least that I've seen, than for men. I know that there's been some studies done on it. I read about some of it in our psychology of gender course that we took. But overwhelmingly, I think a lot of home life and also this relatively new expectation within the culture to do well in school, along with helping out at home. I think the combination of that and getting a little personal here, seeing the different expectations set between me, my male sibling, it does lead to, I think a different kind of pressure. And I think that a lot of women, a lot of other Hispanic women that I've spoken to have experienced similar things.
Yeah, you're getting pretty close to the point I'm going to make. Does anyone else want to contribute? Because I think you're right about this. Anyone else want to add anything to what Megan just said?
Maybe social media has something to do with it. This is just an idea I'm having. I'm really
Yeah,
not
it's
sure.
interesting
I
because
don't even.
I was actually wondering what data to present because I have like some data on cyberbullying that relates to social media, cyberbullying, you know, Twitter, so on and so forth, Facebook. That's really interesting. I collected it in Toledo and also here. So there are differences in the Latino community. That might play into it, but I guess I'm trying to kind of get closer to family dynamics. Part of what happens is there's all sorts of expectations put on, I think, Latina adolescents compared to some of the guys, some of the Latinos. And so Luis, let me get to the next slide. Someone named Luis Zayas. Let me move up one. He came up with a theory, and it's interesting because not much research has looked at this, but I thought it was really interesting because he tried to kind of grapple with what is it about Latin culture, let's say Mexican culture, that might explain this. You know, I had a thesis student, a PhD student in Toledo. She did her thesis on something called the acculturation gap. And you can look up studies on this, and there's a bunch of null findings. You don't really see much because it's really hard to conceptualize this. The idea is that the young acculturate quicker than the parents do. And so parents might be threatened when they see their kids pick up some of the mainstream norms, the non-traditional norms, and it might create family conflict, right? But it's really hard to capture that research-wise. Because what we did is we had an acculturation scale, and we gave the scale to mothers and daughters. And we looked to see where the differences were and whether those differences itself were related to dysfunction in the family or depression and stress and anxiety in the adolescent. And we didn't find anything, and previous studies had not. And I think theoretically it makes sense, but it's really, really hard to capture this research-wise. So a different way to do this is, I think, what Luis Zayas suggested, actually the data that we collected. And to kind of sum up what he has written about in a couple different articles is, first of all, he thinks that increased suicide behavior may be due to parent-adolescent differences in traditional values. So that's kind of what I just mentioned, but how do you capture that? Well, he was pretty specific. He said in families that support cultural beliefs that emphasize deference to parents, restrictions on female autonomy may lead to conflict. When Latina adolescents exert autonomy and they adapt non-traditional values, especially regarding dating behavior. So imagine like a father being very traditional and feels threatened when you have your daughters, they start to date, they start to pick up maybe values that you felt threatened by, and this might lead to conflict in the family. And eventually this might lead to, if you take a system's perspective, it might lead to the Latina adolescent acting out. Not really borderline behavior, maybe suicide attempts or feeling anxious or stressed, or it kind of creates some sort of conflict in the family. Almost like a scapegoating sometimes of the Latina. And so what that means is that there might be disruptive behavior that doesn't necessarily end up in completed suicides, but it ends up in a lot of turmoil. And so I thought, how can I measure this? And I think I did a fairly good job, but does this make sense? I mean, I'm not trying to stereotype families here, but there might be instances in a traditional family in which there might be family conflict that's there because of the differing norms that the Latina adolescents are adapting compared to what the traditional norms are. And so what I did is I collected data here in South Texas, and I focused on 18 or 19-year-olds. And I utilized something called the Marianismo belief scale. And this scale looks at the extent to which a Latina adolescent believes that she should practice cultural values related to female gender. And there's all sorts of subscales. But what the subscale that I focused on was one called virtuous and chaste. So it's the one that dealt most closely to dating behavior, sexual norms, and so forth. And I also measured, and this was really a difficult thing to do, but I found some scales that measured conflict with mother and conflict with father, in addition to family conflict overall. I also wanted to assess the question of, is this really a cultural thing? Or there's a lot of research that looks at something called emotion dysregulation. And that really relates to suicide risk and depression and anxiety. So in other words, can we just explain cultural conflict by using universal constructs? Like, sometimes we just have families where we have a lot of people who display emotional regulation problems. Or is it truly linked to family conflict as relates to cultural norm violations and so forth? So I wanted to try and disentangle these two things. What I found is that the virtuous subscale and father conflict actually were strongly related to lots of the mental health factors in the adolescence. So lower adherence to virtuous was associated with greater levels of father conflict, emotion dysregulation, depression, hopelessness, and suicide behavior. So in other words, those adolescents, those Latina adolescents who were not adhering to the traditional value of being virtuous reported greater levels of conflict, especially with father, and greater levels of emotion regulation problems, as well as greater levels of depression, hopelessness, and suicide behavior. If you took father conflict, you saw that that was related to emotion regulation problems, depression, hopelessness, suicide behavior, lower levels of coping competence. So coping competence is a concept in which if someone feels like one is able to cope very well against stress, that means you have high coping competence. If you feel like you have a lot of learned helplessness going on and therefore you really can't cope well anymore, that's called, you basically don't have good coping competence. So we saw that father conflict was related to lower levels of coping competence. And burdensomeness is like a new term in the field of suicidology, where if you feel like you're a burden on your family, that's closely related to suicide behavior. So we saw that greater father conflict was related to this. So I'm not going to show you like a big correlation table, but I try to summarize some of these correlations because this is really interesting. But to kind of examine this theory that I mentioned, we have to try to set it up in like a psychological model. So let me walk you through this. So it kind of represents what I mentioned a couple of slides ago, which is I was looking at non-adherence to traditional values. So I focused like on the virtuous chaste subscale, but if you look at the whole scale itself, it also fits into this model. So those adolescents who were not adhering to traditional expectations and values reported greater father conflict. Now, let me say, we didn't see greater conflict with mother. We only saw it with father. And we only saw the father conflict when everyone was living in the same household. So in other words, you had to have the Latina adolescent, the mother, and the father living at home. If it was a one-parent family, we didn't see this relationship. If the student was living on campus here, because I collected data from Latina students on campus, then it seemed to create enough of a break from the family stress that we didn't see this relationship. We only saw it when everyone was in the same household. So we see a connection between non-adherence to traditional values, father conflict, and then we saw a connection between father conflict and suicide behavior. However, this relationship between father conflict and suicide behavior was contingent on emotion dysregulation. So this is what I just mentioned earlier, which is having difficulty controlling your emotions, determine whether or not father conflict had a relationship with suicide behavior. So statistically, this is called a moderated mediation analysis. So I don't know if you've had this in statistics. It's something called bootstrap analyses. Have you had this in stats yet, or have you heard about it? Have you all talked about mediation versus moderation? I see some people not in there. It's not really. Okay. So mediation is when one variable leads to another, and then that leads to another. So non-adherence to traditional values leads to father conflict, and then that itself will lead to suicide behavior. Moderation means that the relationship between two variables depends on a third variable. So the relationship between father conflict and suicide behavior was related to emotion regulation. So let me show you what we mean by this, the next slide. The highest suicide behavior occurred is when there was high father conflict and high emotion dysregulation. So this top line here, up here. If you had high father conflict, but you didn't really have problems with emotion regulation, you didn't see the high suicide ideation levels, okay? So what's kind of interesting is I think it's a pretty good representation of the theory that we mentioned, which is father conflict seemed related to feeling threatened with your daughters not adhering to traditional values. But if and only if that your daughter had problems handling her emotions, did suicide behavior occur? Okay, so it's kind of interesting because it's emotion regulation does play into this model, but culture does as well. So it's a kind of neat instance of how culture is associated with more universal psychological constructs. Okay, so it's really complicated, but we did find that all this stuff was related to suicide behavior. And I think the way it works is as I've set it up in this model here. So does anyone have any questions about this? Because this kind of boils down, I think, Louis Zayas's theory, which is culture is important, but emotion regulation plays into whether or not culture has an effect on suicide.
Do you think there would maybe be a difference with other, maybe how other Hispanic cultures would maybe handle this? Like, I'm not very versed, and there's so many different Latino countries, but I've always been curious because I know that because, you know, we're in the US and the majority Latino population is Mexican, most of the studies are on that.
Right.
I've always wondered if, you know, maybe people in South America or Central America who have different cultural influences that Mexicans do, if they.
And that's, I mean, I think I'm a firm believer that you can't lump all Hispanic groups together, right? Which is why I presented earlier Central Americans versus Mexican Americans, right? I think Louis Zayas has done a fair amount of work on Puerto Rican mental health. There's a kind of, it's not a DSM disorder, but ataque de nervios. You know, it's kind of like a borderline sort of behavior, but it's more specific to Hispanic subgroups, especially in the Caribbean, where you have a lot of acting out sort of behavior. And it's hard to talk about this without feeling like you're being stereotypical, but borderline sort of behavior, you know, a lot of cutting of the wrists, a lot of kind of more extroverted behavior, like anxiety ridden. And he has linked some of this cultural value stuff to that, right? He hasn't really linked that to suicide behavior, but what he's shown is that in some Puerto Rican subgroups, there might be family conflict, but interestingly, he's focused on mother conflict and maybe hasn't found anything with father like I did, but the original theory that he spoke about focused more on father than mother. But what he's found is that mother conflict might lead to some of this nervous type of behavior. And that's kind of where he's kept it. He hasn't brought it forward like I have to show that it leads to a lot of suicide behavior. But what's interesting is he's focused on Puerto Rican subgroups. And I think it's really important that we kind of not replicate this in other groups. So I think that's a great study to do. You know, for anyone interested in a research career, you know, maybe part of what you can do for a dissertation, or if any of you become faculty members, is extend this research to other Latino subgroups. So I'm not saying that this holds true. I'm just saying it only holds true for 18 and 19-year-old Latina adolescents here in South Texas at this point in time. And I think it begs the question of whether there's something like this going on in other groups, other age groups. I think there is, But we need to be careful in generalizing these findings. Other questions, other comments at this point?
I
Yeah,
have a
Brittany.
question. What I was curious about is you mentioned that these are young Latinas. By any chance, did you ask for their parents' ages? And the only reason I'm asking is I was wondering if there's a generational gap there. For example, I'm 26 personally, but my parents
Yeah,
had me when they were 40. So their generation is like my older sibling grew up different than I did, but
Yeah.
they had him much younger. They were 20s, and with me,
Yeah.
they were 40. So to me, the generation matters a lot. What parents' generation? I was
I
wondering.
mean, I think that kind of gets closer to the sort of data I collected before, where I think there's so much variability that it's hard to capture things statistically that way, right? I mean, the neat thing about the Marianismo scale is that it's asking for the Latina adolescent's perception. I was tempted to collect data from parents, but I wanted to, how would I say it? I was more interested in Latinas feeling like everything was confidential, anonymous, and I wanted to get as accurate and as honest a perception as I felt like they can give me. And I felt like looping in the family, you kind of muddy things a little bit. And if you have them fill out their Marianismo scale, or at least we kind of get back to the same framework that I used before, and it would get really tricky to kind of look at differences. That's really interesting. Maybe I could slowly add variables like how old your parents are, right? What generation, did parents move here at what age? Or are you second or third generation like my family is? That sort of thing might be interesting. But I wanted to kind of have something, how would I say, Zayas's theory is kind of interesting, but you have to start at the very basics. I wanted to pull out the essence of what he said, collect data, see whether there's anything there, and build on top of it. So lots of the ideas that you all are giving me are good ways to build on top of it. Part of what you have to do research-wise is not get too complicated or ambitious to start. You have to kind of start with the very basics and then build on it. And so I think there's several studies that people can do that stems from these basic findings I have. But these are all very great ideas. But I'm kind of as guilty as anyone about asking for too much data and thinking about things in a very complicated way. And what I've learned out of doing research for maybe 25 years is you gotta, have things that are measurable and that truly represent things that are theoretically relevant, but make sure that each study builds on top of another one. And so that's what we mean by programmatic research, taking things step by step by step by step. I want to talk about one more study. I want to make sure we have enough time to do this. And I don't have to leave exactly at 7. So, if people have questions about this afterwards, I would love to hang around. Okay, so again, the question of what are some of the factors that might explain suicide risk in Latina youth? Being here in the Valley, there's a lot of research looking at obesity, but most of it's looking at obesity and physical health. So I thought, okay, what is there in regards to obesity and suicide behavior? And believe it or not, as of about a year ago, you can count the number of studies that have been done on a couple hands. It's really shocking when you think about it. What the research shows is that there seems to be a connection between obesity and suicide behavior, but mainly only in females. And certainly no research has looked at this in regards to particular ethnic groups. So of course, I was interested in this, and a colleague of mine, Lisa Talavera Garza, she was a lecturer, but now she's a assistant professor. She connected me with someone named Glenn Gray, who kind of collects data here at the college level. Every couple of years, there's something called the National College Health Assessment. That's a nationwide data collection, and UTRGV has participated in it. It's a somewhat lengthy survey that assesses for health behaviors, habits, and perceptions, but there's always some mental health in there. And so what I did is I was able to analyze these data and was able to look at mental health and was able to look at this as it relates to young Latinas. So I kind of like pulled out the data that I thought would help answer some of these questions. And so I ended up with 401 participants. The mean age was about 20. So by, junior status. And I thought, what data do we have in the data set that might help us explain the link between obesity and suicide behavior? Previous studies have found this link, but very few studies have looked at mediators. So again, coming back to this term called mediation, another way to look at what mediators are is they're explanatory variables. So if you have two variables that are related, what sort of variables might explain these relationships? And so let me ask you, if you're looking at obesity and suicide, you find the basic connection. What are some possible variables that might explain why these two variables are connected? So act like you didn't see the slide. What might explain this relationship?
I would have to say culture plays a role.
Mhm.
I don't want to get too personal here, but I know like my family is Mexican, right? And they are always making comments about everyone's weight, basically. And it's a constant what can you say, like behavior. It has been for years.
And what that leads to, I mean, it's a psychological term, as you know, it's a learning behavior, it's modeling. There's some interesting data that suggests that young girls from third grade onward, they start becoming concerned about their appearance, right? Because you see there's a cultural value, right? You see your parents constantly dieting, you hear comments like that, right? And it happens from a very early age on. So there's family and maybe cultural pressures that relate to this. Yeah. What else might connect the two things here?
One-on-one dance
Social
classes.
standards.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, social standards.
Or just any factors whatsoever that might help explain this.
Probably social media.
Social media, yeah. So there's all sorts of variables that we could throw into a study in the future, right? Social media, right? And remember, this is kind of interesting research because I had a data set that was kind of an archival data. I had to pull out things that I thought might relate. But what it's led me to think about are things in the future that I can collect, and what factors does this database not have because it's really, really important. We know there's a connection amongst females, at least, that obesity is related to suicide behavior, in addition to depression, anxiety, and so forth. But what are those mediators? And the reason why it's important to look at the explanatory factors is if we can figure out how these two things are connected, then we can use this data in a very practical way for therapists to work on these mediators. Because if we know that A relates to B through these other variables, if we can work on these other variables in a very applied way, we might reduce suicide risk as it relates to obesity. So let me show you, first of all, in this data set, if you look at BMI, about 5% of the women were underweight, 47% were kind of normal, 22 were overweight, and 27% were obese. The suicide ideation was, it's kind of what you see with college students. And I mentioned earlier the higher rates you see with Latina youth. It shows here 24% had reported lifetime suicide ideation, 12% within the past year. So 1 out of 8 young women were suicidal, 6% during the past month, 5% during the past 2 weeks, and 10% reported attempting suicide during their lives. So it's pretty darn high. BMI, if you look at correlations, was associated with sleep problems, health problems, dissatisfaction with appearance, depression, hopelessness, suicide ideation, and suicide attempts. So if you look at correlations, they were connected. Association between obesity and suicide ideation was mediated by sleep problems, health problems, and dissatisfaction with appearance. The reason why I was looking at sleep is there's more and more research that suggests that having difficulty sleeping is related to suicide. And also health problems are a suicide risk factor. So here are some of the correlations. So BMI, some of the correlations are getting pretty high, 0.35, 0.33. If you look at suicide ideation, it's related to sleep problems, health problems, dissatisfaction with the way that one looks, depression, pretty high, and just suicide ideation and attempts are pretty highly related. So again, I'll give you these PowerPoints later, but the correlations are all pretty high. But again, what's important is how do all of these relate to each other if you put them in a model. I did a regression, and I use this regression in the next slide. I'll show you how I plotted these out. But sleep problems, health problems, dissatisfaction with appearance. The reason why you want to run a multiple regression is quite often when you do, some of the things that were correlated are no longer coming out as significant. But everything was. BMI in step 1 was highly significant at the 0.001 level. And then when you add sleep problems, health problems, and appearance dissatisfaction, they're all were still highly related to suicide ideation. In other words, none of them canceled anyone out. Sometimes what happens in a regression is some of the variables cancel each other out because they're all highly related with each other. But what was kind of neat here is that everything was related to ideation. Okay. And so let me kind of summarize it. We ran, again, what are called bootstrap analyses. It's a new way to look at mediation. But if you put everything together, we'll see that obesity and ideation, once you have these 3 variables in the equation, obesity is no longer related to ideation. That's because all the mediators kind of explain the relationship. But what you do now with bootstrap analyses is you look at what are called confidence intervals. So what that shows is that if none of the confidence intervals cross a 0 value, that means there's at least a 95% chance that there is an indirect influence. In other words, that these factors do mediate the relationship between obesity and suicide ideation. So in other words, those people who are obese were also having sleep problems, health problems, but also they weren't happy with the way that they appeared. And this kind of helped explain why obesity was associated with ideation. It's interesting that, we talked about how in the family, sometimes there's a lot of talk about appearance. Well, sure enough, those young women who weren't happy with the way they appeared, that itself was related to obesity and ideation. So I was limited in this study because, again, I had a database that the data were already collected, but I was able to pull out the data that I thought would be interesting. And so that leads me to think about what else might we study in the future if we're studying obesity and suicide ideation. So to summarize this study, it was mediated by sleep problems, health problems, and appearance. And what I found is that there was some research that when you compare ethnic groups, Latina women were more accepting of their body image and size compared to other ethnic groups. In other words, sometimes there's a stereotype that Latina women aren't as concerned about the way they look compared to other groups. But what we're seeing is that this data suggests otherwise. It shows that dissatisfaction with body image is related to suicide risk here. Some of the other mediators that I think we really need to look at are things such as shame. Maybe the way you look, if you're overweight and you feel a sense of shame, that probably relates to mental health, but we didn't have this in this database. So I think we should look at those sorts of psychological factors. But also there's a little bit of research out there that suggests that lack of success at losing weight, you might get more and more frustrated, and that might lead to more suicide ideation, more depression, and so forth. And also self-efficacy, which is a psychological term that kind of assesses whether or not you feel like you have it within yourself to make change. Those women who might have higher levels of self-efficacy, that might serve as a protective factor against poor mental health. On the other hand, if individuals don't have self-efficacy, that might be a mediator as well. It might help explain obesity and suicide ideation. So I think there's all sorts of factors out there we can look at that we haven't looked at yet. And I think some of these are particular to Latina youth as well. So I want to end it here, but I want to see if anyone has any other ideas about possible mediators that we might explore here. Self-efficacy, shame, lack of success at losing weight. These are three that I'm proposing, but I'm sure there's a lot of other things out there we could be measuring.
I would, I've, well, I would maybe think lack of access to mental health resources.
Mhm.
I know that in Latino culture, a lot of seeking help for mental health is often stigmatized, especially in that culture.
Right.
I think when you couple that also with Latinos being, I believe, the least likely ethnicity or culture to have any kind of health insurance. So even those who do want to seek the help may not have the financial resources to seek that help. That may be an issue. Also, I know that in Latino culture, there's lots of diabetes, hypothyroidism. Maybe being able to have more medical resources means being able to see more doctors and keeping their weight under control as soon as they see an issue, instead of waiting for that issue to escalate to the point where they have to immediately seek any kind of medical care.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, because what I reported in these findings is just someone's self-perception of how good their health has been over the past year. They didn't really talk about whether it's diabetes and so forth, but yet obesity will bring on all sorts of physical health problems. And one of the points that I wanted to make is that the physical and the emotional health, they're not completely separate. You know, there's some research, for example, that will show that up to 20% of people who are depressed have chronic health problems. So that just shows that physical health problems have a great influence on how you're doing emotionally, right? So I think, you know, kind of parsing that apart, you know, I had this very simple variable about self-perception of physical health. You know, what sort of physical health problems contribute to emotional problems, for example? That'd be kind of interesting to do, or to look at as mediators. What else? Anything? So sleep, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to dominate or anything. I
No,
just
no.
talk too much. I think also because I work with Dr. Talavera
Okay.
for older Latino mental health, but my focus is on dementia. And I found a lot of studies that, especially Latina women who are caregivers, and you know, we see Latina women being caregivers as young as, you know, children, teenage years. That might also, I think, have an influence on, you know, obesity, having less time to cook well, having less time to exercise, and maybe adding on to that societal pressure, because like Brittany had mentioned earlier, that generational gap does have an
Yeah.
influence. So, you know, a young teenager who's assimilated to the culture in the United States may have a bit of a difficult time adhering to, you know, the kind of image issues represented by a grandmother who grew up in a different country.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's got to be a way that we can look at some sort of cultural mediator here. The reason why I thought, again, to get back to the whole physical health thing, you know, when you hear about obesity, you hear about not just physical problems, but also sleep apnea, snoring, you know, things that affect your sleep. And then there's a line of research, as I mentioned, that looks at sleep problems that relate to suicide behavior. So again, I think we, in the field of suicidology, we've done a traditionally very poor job of kind of building theory or connecting variables in a more complicated way other than just correlations, right? So I think part of what we have to try to do here is to figure out how everything relates together, right? And part of what I've done as a researcher is I'm always looking at the universal constructs that are out there, but also how does culture fit into each of these frameworks, right? And it's interesting to kind of hear you all kind of brainstorm about this. The difficult thing is how to capture that methodologically. You know, don't be afraid. I mean, part of the measures that I've used, I've created because I've had to. There wasn't like a migrant farm worker stress measure. Even looking at religion, I mean, I came up with a few simple measures that I've used my whole career because I couldn't find anything I liked as a grad student. And of course, you have to be rigorous and you have to analyze the reliability of these tools and the validity. And also, there's got to be a lot of good translation work done. I mean, some of these measures I've used, I've rigorously had people help me translate them, and I've used them ever since. And it's kind of neat because then other researchers out there in the world, they'll ask, can they use your translations? And usually I let them. but you're helping the whole field with some of the stuff that you're doing, right? So I wanted to mention a couple other studies I'm involved in, just to let you know, I'm not just doing this. I mean, part of the reason why I moved to South Texas is I've done so much research that is more kind of on the community level, but we haven't really applied a lot of this to the ground level. I mean, I've worked with a lot of community agencies, especially dealing with farm workers, where I've done a lot of training of like promotorists, for example, who work on a day-to-day basis with community members. But some of what my colleagues and I are doing, we're trying to get grant money to kind of apply a lot of what we've learned. So my colleague, Dr. Seligman, she's had a couple of grants now that look at dental anxiety and how can we alleviate dental anxiety in youth. Believe it or not, dental phobia is a big problem in Latino youth. The reason being is it's very closely related to SES, but there's a lot of cultural norms at play too. And I saw this in my family. You know, sometimes you have kids who go to bed with juice or soda in a bottle, right? It's just kind of what you do, or milk even. And it's bad for the teeth. But for SES reasons, you don't see a dentist until you've had really bad stuff going on. And then it becomes such a traumatic experience because part of what happens here as a kid is you're strapped into a chair and the work is done whether or not you want to be done. And then you develop a major dental phobia, you never want to go back to the dentist. But yet there's more research that suggests that bad dental health leads to long-term physical health problems like heart disease, right? So it's really important to provide a treatment that will cure this in a really quick, efficient way. So there's one session treatments for simple phobias that we're trying to adapt in a culturally specific way, right? So not everything I do is questionnaire based. You know, a lot of what we're interested in doing, and actually Dr. Talavera is involved in some of these dental anxiety studies as well, is we're trying to kind of bring a lot of what we know to the community. And a lot of what we see with COVID that I was interested pre-COVID is telemental health. And there's not much research that has looked at telemental health in Latinos, but here in the Valley, I don't know if you know this, but like if you go to outside of Hidalgo and Cameron, there's no doctoral level licensed psychologists serving these communities like Starr County, for example. But the best way to do this is maybe through telemental health. And some of the data that we've seen suggests that for at least anxiety disorders and depression, telemental health done properly with CBT is just about as effective as in-person treatment, right? So we got to be really creative in how we do this. So I would love to get some grant money to develop like a telemental health center, right? So that's kind of what I focused on. I mean, these projects that I'm showing you now, it's kind of on the side. It's easy to collect data and to explore this, but my real interest is bringing this to the ground level and helping people in the Valley and then deciding what works, what doesn't, and then transport some of these treatments outside the Valley. That's kind of like my main interest now in what I'm doing. But we're at the phase now where we're just trying to bring in some grant money to get these projects off the ground. So that's kind of where I am in my career. So if anyone has any questions about just being a psychologist, grad school, I mean, we don't have to just have to ask or answer questions about the data here. I kind of feel like I want to help anyone out who has questions just about being a psychologist.
I just wanna, you can go.
Oh,
Megan?
no, you go ahead. I'll go after.
Okay.
I just want to know how, I don't know if you were doing any type of research when COVID hit.
Yeah,
And
actually,
if so, how did it affect you?
I have a lot of data. Dr. Chirac, Dr. Hurai, Dr. Talavera, me, and Dr. Seligman, we actually collected really good longitudinal data. We're still collecting phase 2, but we collected data as soon as COVID hit. The IRB approved this as like an emergency thing because we wanted mental health data, but it's not just focused on Latinas. We collected data nationwide, but we're very interested in how having a pre-pandemic anxiety disorder, how that affects your functioning during this pandemic. Because if you remember, I'm vaccinated, thank goodness. My son is, who has asthma, my wife, but we were scared to death because all 3 of our kids have respiratory issues as it is. And this is like a breathing disorder. And just feeling like getting something which you're having trouble breathing was ripe for just right? So we realized anxiety was going to be a big component of how people dealt with this. And so we collected data where half the sample had a pre-existing anxiety disorder. And they told us what it was: social, panic, OCD, and so forth. And then half the sample did not. And what we have seen, and we haven't published this yet, but we've looked at some of the data, is that those who have a pre-existing anxiety disorder function much worse during the pandemic, much worse. We collected data mostly on people who did not have COVID, because this was back in March. And suicide played into this as well. You know, those individuals who had a pre-existing anxiety disorder and were lacking social support and were more anxious about getting COVID were much more suicidal. And we had other variables, like we have a scale called like intolerance of uncertainty. So those individuals who just regularly don't deal well with things being uncertain in the future were much more suicidal. So you can imagine, you know, COVID is scary and you don't know whether the world's coming to an end or not. So having that naturally as part of as one of your personality traits set you up to cope much less well and to feel more suicidal and depressed and so forth. So we have a lot of COVID related data that we just haven't published yet, although we've started to analyze it. And we started collecting data from the very same participants early March, because we want to capture a good longitudinal sample. So we have about 400 people we collected data from. And right now, I think we've collected data from 300 of the same people a year later. And this is great data because it'll really tell us how much having pre-existing anxiety hurt you as you try to cope throughout this whole year. So at some point we're going to publish this, but we're still collecting phase 2 of the data. So it's kind of real neat that we have this data. So,
It's pretty interesting, actually.
yeah. Other questions?
I was gonna ask maybe did you always know that you wanted to go into research, or?
Oh, I meant to mention that. No, believe it or not, I went to grad school. I had lived in California my whole life. I thought in a way, it's gonna sound funny, right? I thought in a way I was gonna go off, become, get trained to be a therapist, come back and be like a therapist to the stars. And what I meant by that, just set up a private practice in the Westwood area, which is where I went to school at UCLA, and just make, a good living. I mean, enjoy what I'm doing and providing therapy that was empirically validated and so forth. But just, live the good life, see 30 clients during the week. And that's all I wanted to do. But what happened is I actually was fortunate to be on fellowship. So when I went to University of Michigan, I could have just got my degree with only getting therapy training. But at some point I thought I want to challenge myself. So starting my second year in grad school, beyond, well, first of all, I was very interested in research because of my experiences, as I mentioned. But then I became very interested in seeing what teaching was like. And I don't know if any of you have taught or been a TA, but it's really scary because my very first course was a course in which there's 120 students. And you know how it is, you walk in to a classroom and everyone's chit-chatting, but as a professor or as a grad student who was teaching the course, as soon as I walked in, everyone stopped talking. And they all just stared at me like, okay, we're ready for your teaching. And it's like, psychologically, that's called exposure, which is you're anxious as all heck, but you're not gonna remain anxious forever. And eventually your heart rate will calm down and you'll become more relaxed and you'll get used to it. And I found out that I really love teaching. And so I do like being a therapist, and not here, but in Toledo, I had a small private practice on the side, right? But I also have provided much supervision to grad students in their therapy work. But first and foremost, I wanted to be a faculty member. And I think I figured that out halfway through graduate school. And it drove my family crazy because they all wanted me to come home and be a therapist to the stars, right? People had a lot of money, right? But no, I wanted to be a faculty member. And I did enough research, had enough publications, and was lucky enough to get a faculty job right after grad school. And I've been happy ever since. I mean, I'm glad you asked that question because I meant to mention it. Don't be afraid to let your educational experience influence what you do career-wise. Because I was dead set on being a therapist and coming back to California and being with family. I'm never going to move back to California, and I know that. It's too expensive, it's too crowded. It's nice to have the buffer zone between your family and you know, that sort of thing. That's a great question. I didn't know that I was going to end up being a faculty member, but I think it's the right career choice. Whereas if you talk to other of my colleagues, lots of people will say, hey, from high school, or even before that, I knew what I wanted to do. That wasn't me. You know, I went to UCLA thinking I was going to be a school teacher. Then I went to Michigan thinking I was going to be a therapist, but no.
Would you ever consider opening your own practice again?
You know, I would, because there's a big need here in the Valley, right? I mean, part of what we did, and by the way, full disclosure, I'm married to Dr. Seligman, right? And that's not a secret, but we had a private practice in Toledo, and it was called the Northwest Ohio, the Anxiety Center of Northwest Ohio. And our webpage, and it might still be out there, what we did, we provided empirically validated treatment for anxiety disorders and depression. And everything we did was scientifically based. And we only saw maybe 4 clients each a week. We took insurance, but also people paid out of pocket. But there's so many people out there who weren't happy with the supportive therapy they were getting. And they're looking to get treatment that they thought had more scientific basis to it. And, you know, we helped most of the people we saw, and they were forever grateful because of it. And my colleague and wife, she focused on adolescents, families, and adults every now and then, but I focused only on adults. And we, you know, in order to come to our clinic, we did a very thorough intake, and you had to have met the criteria for a true anxiety disorder or depression. Otherwise, we kind of referred you out. So we were very specific in what we were experts in. But there's a huge market for it because there's a lot of people out there who were not happy with the therapies that they were getting. Here in the Valley, I think the same can be said. There's a lot of, we know a lot of pediatricians, a lot of dentists, a lot of parents who they have people they know or they have patients who are looking for good psychological help, and it's hard to come by. And we ourselves are not seeing patients right now. But at some point, if we do, at least there'll be a home for some of these. And the thing about establishing a clinical psych PhD program, and I know psychiatry in the School of Medicine, they're starting clinical stuff, is it's just getting started. And lots of these are training clinics, and the therapies provided are going to be pretty good, but they're, you know, they're being given by beginners. What's missing here are like real experts who are seasoned and know what they're doing, right? The VA provides pretty good treatment for some things, PTSD and so forth, but it's very limited to veterans, right? I think especially in, you know, some of the more rural areas here, good psychological treatment is hard to come by. So we might at some point open something up, but it's not going to be for the next year or two, because my Dr. Seligman just got a big grant that's going to take 3 years over time. And if we get the dental anxiety grant, I'm going to be focused so much on supervising dental assistants on providing therapy that I myself might not have much time to do anything on the side. So, other questions?
There was one question on the chat.
Sure. Okay. Oh, I see it. Okay. You know, that's a great question. The question is, would you recommend a PhD program if one is primarily interested in doing therapy and not research? Or would a master's be the better route? There's also something called a PsyD program, which is a doctoral level degree, but you don't have much research training. It's mostly being a therapist, training to become a therapist. The thing about a PhD program is you'll get a master's program halfway through, unless you have an MA as you enter the PhD program. Most PhD programs provide funding to you. So if I get accepted into a PhD program in this country, chances are they're going to give me a TA-ship or a fellowship for at least 4 years. And that's nice. Most master's programs, like our program here, that, you know, there might be some TA-ship money available, but a lot of students take out loans. In regards to becoming a therapist, in most states you can practice with a master's degree. You know, I had a license in Michigan in which I was able to practice as part of my graduate training with a master's. In Ohio, you need a PhD to become licensed. Here in Texas, you can practice with a master's degree. I think you have to ask yourself what state, I mean, it's going to be hard to figure this one out maybe, but what state do you envision yourself living in down the line? And look, each state makes up their own psychology licensing guidelines. It's not a national thing. You have to look at the state guidelines and see whether or not they would allow a master's level license. Most states do. Texas does. And that's okay, because you can become licensed and make money as a therapist and be a good therapist and probably be happy. The thing that a PhD will do is open up the doors to do other things other than providing therapy. Teaching, consulting, research as a faculty member. There's a lot of PhDs who are hired by big business for their statistical skills, for example, for their consulting skills, and they make a fair amount of money doing that. So a PhD will open up more doors, but if you're really, really set on being a therapist and you know that's what you want to do career-wise, getting a master's level degree would be a great option. So that's a good question. I'm mentoring a couple grad students. Part of what I'm not part of the PhD program right now, and I'll be open about it. It's because I want to mentor students who have the time to actually do research. And the PhD curriculum, as we have it set up now, it's like a PsyD curriculum. It's really heavy on the clinical training, which is fine. That's what it's set up to do at this moment. But I know some of the PhD students don't have time to do much research. And so I'm mentoring students who are in the master's program. And I also have worked with some undergrads on projects. COVID has really bit into that. So right now I only have a few students and we're trying to do everything over Zoom. But once everyone's vaccinated and once everything's near normal in the fall, I'll have more group meetings, lab-based meetings and things like that. I have a pretty good website. So if anyone wants to look at it to see the sort of things I've done, lots of the stuff I published, it's there. I think there's a short page that mentions the sort of current projects I have going on. But I'm open to mentoring students. Just email me. And I only mentor students in which we have overlapping interests. And I kind of feel like I can do a good job. If someone comes to me and says, hey, I want to be mentored in a given topic that I'm not an expert in, I'll help them find someone else, but it wouldn't do us any good. And I only mentor students on projects that I think are worthy. It's not a scary thing, but I ask the student to think about projects that, number one, advance things in the field of psychology. It's got to be a study that's programmatic, that builds on top of other research. Number two is a publishable. You know, I don't want to do like a strict correlational study that is kind of neat to do, but it's a waste of time for both of us. You know, a student should get involved in research in such a way that's going to help her or his career as well, not just mine. So. Oh, you're welcome. I just saw something come up saying thank you.
Yeah, so this is going to lead to another question.
Okay.
So you have a lab, right? Do you take research assistants? Are you going to be taking any assistants as we start going back to normal?
You know, I've had a couple inquiries from people who are graduating and have already applied to grad school, and it's not worth, I don't think that experience would be a good one if I said, yeah, for the next 6 weeks, let's work. Now, I think it's best if students get involved in projects that are kind of at the beginning stage, in addition to things that are already ongoing, so that I can provide you like either an authorship on a poster or a paper. But I think it'd be great for students to get involved in the development of certain studies. So I usually like a student to be with me for at least a semester, or if someone wants to kind of help out beginning the summer, at least through the summer. In regards to getting recommendations, I have served on so many committees that decide on whether to accept students for graduate programs, that the sort of letter that only says, hey, I took someone's class, or such and such a student took my class and received an A, that doesn't really say much. I know it's hard to get letters, but they should be the sort of letters where the professor really knows you, and maybe where you've done a little bit of work for the professor, where the professor can say, look, this student was involved in this project. She or he has these qualities. We were able to, look at these findings, and we got poster presentations out of it. Something that the professor can talk about personal attributes. That's going to help your graduate school application. If you have 3 letters in which it basically says they got A's in a course, you're not going to get into that program. And that's why I took 2 years off. I know being young and being ambitious, but you're going to live a long life. And taking those 2 years off helped me get into my dream program, right? I actually was testing the waters and got accepted into grad school right away. But I realized these aren't ideal programs for me. They don't really even have any funding for me. And if I want to get a PhD but end up owing 150,000, I can do it. I'd rather take 2 years off, become more competitive, and get into a program that really wants me for who I am. And that worked out for me. It really did. So don't be afraid to take a year or 2 off, especially if you already have a job where you can live at home while you get the other experience that you might need to be competitive. And it's easy for me to say it, don't be afraid to look outside the valley either. We have clinical programs here. Counseling program has master's programs. We have a PhD program, but yet there's other great programs in Texas. And I've known some really good undergraduates at UTRGV who have ended up in programs outside of Texas, but also PhD programs within the state, within driving distance, right? So look outside of UTRGV if you can. But the best way to approach professors, it's easy enough if someone's worked for me in a lab. And sometimes early on, I'll say, look, I might not be able to pay you, but if you do a good job, I'll write you a really good letter of rec, right? Sometimes if I know a student who's taken my course, 2 or 3 of my courses, I might know enough about the student to write a letter of recommendation. The best way to approach it when we're not in the middle of a pandemic is make an appointment with a professor and ask in person. Otherwise, just shoot a very cordial, nice email. And I know we can't meet in person nowadays, but usually when you make that human touch, it's easier to have a success. And don't be afraid to ask, because the worst is that they say, I don't think I could write you a good letter because I don't know you well enough, right? Just move on to the next professor. But I've had students who take courses of mine who make it a point in the first week or 2 to introduce themselves, just so I know who they are. And that really helps me remember who they are. So if the time comes when someone asks for a letter or something, or asks to work in my lab, there's already that connection. And that, that really helps. So my main advice is be professional about it, right? Remind the professor who you are, remind them that they did well in your class, or that you met them in office hours, or that you worked with them a year ago. And give them 2 weeks at least. I've had people approach me with 2 days to go, and I can't do it, It's common courtesy to give at least 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks. Other pieces of advice or anything? Yeah, Brittany.
Yeah, I have a question. Basically, I got accepted into a graduate program today, so I'm like, yay, super excited.
Congrats to you. Congrats.
Thank you. Clinical rehabilitation counseling. So, and my interest in research actually is up your alley. It's suicidology. Mainly I'm interested in like chronic illness, disabilities, chronic pain, and that regulation kind of interaction. And right now I'm currently replicating someone else's study, which is anxiety sensitivity moderating perceived burdensomeness. But it was done in a white area basically, and I'd like to do it here in the Valley. So I was wondering if I could run that by you, or if you have any recommendations of like books to read or anything on that subject.
Yeah, why don't you email me on the side? Yeah, I had a grad student who actually did an interest, and the findings came out great, but he hasn't written it up yet. But looking at the interaction of anxiety sensitivity and God, what did he? But he looked at something very similar in Latinos and found some interesting stuff. Rumination it was, because in suicide, you see more and more research looking at rumination, and you see more and more looking at anxiety sensitivity. But I thought that these 2 things were connected. And sure enough, there's like nice interactions there. But yeah, I can recommend some stuff, or we can just have a separate Zoom and talk more about it. Okay. Congratulations to you on being accepted. That's great.
Thank you so much, sir. If you ever need help or need anything, I'm like, yeah, I'll send you
Okay.
an email.
Awesome. Anything else? I know we've talked a long time.
Anyone else have any questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah.
Anything?
Oh, sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
You make it.
So I'm actually a post-baccalaureate student. My first degree has like nothing to do with this. But I came back because I couldn't work anymore with COVID. And I'm kind of worried about my letters of recommendation because my entire, bachelor's in psychology has been pretty much exclusively online. Well, actually, no, it has all been online.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's kind of, I'm not sure if you have any maybe like suggestions, anything like that.
You know, what I would do, because you always have to write a statement of purpose, right? And I think in this day and age of COVID, you can maybe get the best letters you can, and in your statement, just mention that things are really hindered, with interactions, with ability of students to work with faculty directly because of the pandemic. But you got 3 letters from people you took courses from. They have good things to say about your performance. Put it in the proper context. Because if I'm on a graduate committee, hopefully I'm keeping in mind that this past year has been crazy, to be honest. But I might need the reminder that I shouldn't have the same set of expectations that I've had in previous years. But it's up to you to present that to whoever's reading your application. Just remind them that a lot of you have kind of worked under COVID conditions, and you've done the best to connect with professors and so forth. But these aren't the letters that you might typically see outside of a pandemic. Do it in a nice way, but just kind of give them that prompt, that little reminder that we're in a different age at this point. You're welcome. Okay. But hi, Stephanie.
No, I was just going to ask if anyone else had anything else to say. Otherwise, I guess we can end the session. I know we've been talking for a long time, so you're probably tired.
No, I've enjoyed meeting with everyone, and anyone on this session or anyone who sees the recording of it. Any questions about anything I do, or even if you're gonna, be able to kind of commit up to a semester, if you want to kind of join with some of the work I'm doing, feel free to reach out and we can start talking about it. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, have a good evening, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to do this.
You're welcome.
We really appreciate it. And
Thanks.
I'll go ahead and just this recording, send you it will be up on our page later. So
Okay.
I'll send you the link to that.
And what I'll do is I'll also send you the PowerPoints, because there's a lot of information I didn't bother going over that might be interesting for people.
Yeah, definitely. I'll send it out. Thank you
Okay.
so much again.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, everyone.